With the recent attacks on the Arch user repository, where tons and tons of packages that are orphaned are being taken over and injected with malware, there have been a lot of discussions in the Linux community about switching away from Arch Linux. So the biggest problem with Arch Linux is that its package base actually isn't that big compared to other distributions, and so because of that, if you are not using Flatpaks or snaps or app images, then you're going to have to rely on the AUR for a lot of different software, which, as we have just seen, does have some trust issues given that anybody can make a package for the AUR. So I just wanted to make a quick video on some of the distros that do serve as good alternatives to Arch Linux. Now, to start off, I do want to just say, if you are switching because of the AUR, I do think that a little bit of the mania around Arch Linux right now is a little bit of fear-mongering because, yeah, the AUR can be unsafe, but Arch Linux is not an unsafe distribution to use. You just need to make sure you're actually vetting the package build files, or just stick to packages from the official repository for Arch Linux, or even just Flatpaks, app images, and things like that. Although app images you also need to vet too, but FlatHub is pretty safe. There hasn't ever been malware on FlatHub as of the making of this video. So yeah, I do think a little bit of the mania around switching away from Arch and if Arch is safe to use, that is just fear-mongering. The fear-mongering gets people views. That's partially why I'm doing this video, so that I could pay my rent next semester. But I'm not going to lie to you and say you need to switch off of Arch. If you are switching for that reason, there are other options. That said, if you just want peace of mind, you don't want to deal with the AUR or with Flatpaks and app images, things like that, and you want safe, vetted repositories, some of these other distributions may be good for you to look at. So in order to evaluate Arch alternatives, because technically any Linux distro could be an alternative to Arch, we need to talk about why people love Arch Linux so much so that we can actually look for distributions that can actually fill in the void that would exist if Arch were to disappear. So Arch Linux is loved because it is a rolling release distribution with very bleeding edge packages. You're getting the latest version of every software in its repository, and because it's a rolling release, you can just continue to upgrade your system and you don't have to go from Fedora 43, Fedora 44, Fedora 45, or Windows 10, Windows 11. You could just continue to update your existing operating system. It's also a very DIY build-it-yourself distribution. It doesn't really handhold you, so if you want to build like a very custom system, a lot of people love to use Arch Linux as a base for that. Additionally, Arch has probably the best documentation of any Linux distribution. Its wiki is massive. There's articles for just about everything you would need to know about Linux, and people point to the Arch wiki as a documentation source. And other than package management, a lot of the things on the Arch wiki will apply to any other distro, even ones on this list. And with that, Arch has a huge community of very technical Linux users who know their way around a system who can help you. Although note that this community does expect you to actually look things up, Google things, read the documentation before you ask a question. You are going to get a lot of RTFM type answers from the Arch community, but that's just part of the nature of running a distro that isn't made for beginners. And then the last huge benefit, even though maybe it wouldn't be a benefit now with the recent malware attacks, but the AUR is a huge part of why people love Arch. Any type of package you can think of will be found in the AUR. So proprietary apps, apps straight from Git, even patch versions of apps, like there's GDK Classic, which is a GDK 3 Classic, here it is, which is a patch version of GDK. People love the AUR. With that in mind, let's start talking about the alternatives. And the first distribution I want to show is an honorable mention, and that is going to be Solus. So the main reason I'm putting Solus in this list is because it does have a bleeding edge package base and it is a rolling release. And this is a good option if you're looking for just a rolling release bleeding edge desktop distribution to install and not have to worry about. So this isn't a DIY build it yourself option similar to Arch. You will have to download an ISO. They have ISOs here for Budgie, which was actually developed by them back in the day. Now it's a separate organization, as well as GNOME, XFCE, and Plasma. That said, it does have quite a few things that make me hesitant to recommend it. So one, Solus has a very small repository. If we go to packages.org and we look at Solus Polaris, that's the current version of the Solus repository. It only has about 8,000 packages. In comparison, Arch Linux, if we combined Core, Extra, and Multilib, the base repository minus the AUR has almost double the packages that Solus has. And keep in mind, like I said earlier, Arch's repository is very highly vetted and curated, and it's known for being small, which is part of the reason why the AUR has to even exist. So Arch already having a small repository, and Solus has almost half as many packages, that may be a huge problem for some. And it doesn't have an alternative to the AUR. So if you're running Solus, you're going to be highly dependent on Flatpaks, snaps, and app images. Another thing, the documentation's decent, but it isn't going to be as thorough as the Arch Wiki or even the Debian or Fedora documentation that's available. It's good enough for most people if you're a desktop user. And it's a pretty small distribution, so the community is just going to be pretty small. There may not be very many places to get help for Solus. And finally, the maintenance history of Solus has been pretty bumpy. So yes, I'm citing Wikipedia, but I do remember most of this happening because I've been in the Linux community for a long time. So since I remember most of this happening, I know this is factually accurate. But Solus has had a bumpy history of maintenance where when the original founder left for a while, they didn't have access to some of their infrastructure, such as the domain. Wikipedia doesn't actually say that, but I remember them having to change the domain because they lost access to some infrastructure when the founder left back in 2018. And then later in 2023, Solus actually got marked as dormant on DistroWatch because a lot of the team members just didn't have the resources to continue to maintain the project because a lot of people left. And they even had 4 months where a bunch of Solus infrastructure was down. And while since then they have gotten back on track, they're also going to be eventually rebasing Solus on Serpent OS and turning it into an atomic distro, which I don't see as a bad thing, but it is just an upcoming change. And so because of that, I don't really see Solus as a platform to be that stable, and that is the main reason I put it as an honorable mention. Now next up we have Fedora. Now Fedora is not a rolling release distro, but just about everything else about Fedora to me makes it a great alternative to Arch. So Fedora has a huge repository and just a giant ecosystem around it. There's RPM Fusion, there's Terra as another alternative repo. There's Fedora Copar, which is somewhat of an alternative to the AUR. It isn't individual packages, but it lets anyone make their own repository for Fedora very easily, and there's a lot of projects in Copar. I'm actually using it to develop stillOS. The Fedora community is huge. The documentation for Fedora is excellent and very easy to navigate. Not as good as Arch is, but it's probably the second best at the moment for Linux distributions in terms of just the amount of information and navigation. And Fedora has something called the Fedora Everything ISO, which allows you to actually build your own Fedora install from scratch, kind of similar to how you do it on Arch. You don't have to partition and do all that manually the same way you would with Arch, but you can just use the existing Fedora packages and build out a system from scratch exactly to your likings, just like how a lot of people would use Arch for. I have a whole video about that I'm gonna put on my end screen. The package base is going to be pretty cutting edge, so on every new Fedora release, which is only every 6 months, you're going to be getting the latest GNOME, the latest desktop environments, the latest everything. So you're not going to be that far behind an Arch installation in terms of the availability of the latest packages. Now, like I said, this isn't a rolling release. It is somewhat of a semi-rolling release. So you will have to do a distribution upgrade every 6 months to a year. To me, I actually see that as a benefit because it keeps everything API stable until you're ready to actually do your upgrade. So I'm not going to be running updates on my Fedora system and be stressed about it breaking my workflow on my system the same way I would with a Arch update, for example, because I'm personally a huge fan of GNOME, and every time GNOME drops an update, all the extensions break, and you have to deal with that every time there's a GNOME release. And so Fedora not being a rolling release lets me put that off to some weekend where I don't have anything to do and I can spend that actually maintaining my system. Whereas with Arch, if I want to keep my system up to date, which you should if you want a secure system, I have to potentially worry about that every time I do an upgrade. And honestly, same with all of these distros, but Fedora doesn't have that problem. But that said, there are a lot of people who do like that rolling release, so you aren't getting that with Fedora. Now, the next alternative I have is actually Debian. No, I'm not talking about old, crusty Debian stable. Sorry, I'm not trying to insult it. Debian stable is good, just not what we're looking for here. I'm talking about Debian Sid, aka unstable. Now, I know the name Debian unstable is scary, but it's unstable the same way Arch is unstable, where you're probably not going to have packages completely break your Debian unstable install. Just the unstable means it's not API stable. So that example I used earlier with GNOME, for example, where a GNOME update breaks all of your extensions, that's what API unstable is going to be. And that's just a natural consequence of rolling release distributions. And so that's why they call it Debian unstable. But I know for marketing, Debian unstable isn't a very good name, which is partly why they use Debian Sid as the name. With all of that though, you get Debian's huge repositories, plus pretty much everything you need, like Google Chrome, Discord, just a lot of proprietary software you might need. Almost all of them provide a .deb package because of how widely used Debian and Ubuntu are. And Debian unstable has a very cutting edge package base, just like Arch Linux does. I put cutting edge on the slide. It's actually more bleeding edge than it is cutting edge. Cutting edge is not the latest, but it's like the latest stable, whereas bleeding edge is always the latest. Fedora would be cutting edge. But yeah, Debian unstable is going to give you bleeding edge packages. Debian's a huge distribution with years of documentation. Just the only problem with the docs here is that most of it is for Debian stable and not for Debian Sid. So there may be differences there. But Debian also has a very big community, and it's pretty easy to get a minimal installation of Debian going if you just use the net installer and not check any desktop environments. Then you can just build out your system from scratch, just like how you would on Arch. And actually for Debian unstable specifically, you do have to get a Debian mini ISO and go into advanced options and expert install and then switch it to a unstable repository, but it will still give you a very minimal system the same way installing Arch would if you do that process. Now the drawbacks of this is technically this is a dev branch of Debian. It is stable enough for desktop use, and I have known people who run Debian Sid, but just keep that in mind. Debian as a project prioritizes Debian stable, and they use unstable as a testing branch. There's also Debian testing, which is a little bit slower moving than Debian unstable. You're still going to get the latest stuff just a little bit later. So Debian testing is also a very good option for its sort of a Arch Linux style use case. And then additionally, there is no direct alternative to the AUR, although that is okay because most projects do provide .deb files. Now the last distribution on this list is OpenSUSE Tumbleweed, and this is probably the most popular distribution to be used as a direct alternative to Arch Linux. So like Fedora and Debian, it does have a big repository, although if we were to sort them in terms of repository size, it would be Solus, then Arch as the sort of smaller repositories, and then OpenSUSE Tumbleweed in the middle, and then Fedora and Debian ahead of OpenSUSE. So it doesn't have as many as Fedora and Debian do, but it's big enough for most use cases. It's also going to be pretty bleeding edge, but the packages are a little bit better tested than Arch is, so there may sometimes be delays compared to when Arch gets packaged, but it's not going to be too bad. It's also another distro that does give you an option to have a minimal install that you can actually build out yourself, and they have something called Open Build Service right here, which does make it pretty easy to build your own OpenSUSE packages, although it isn't as easy to navigate as the AUR or Copar, so it may be hard to actually find packages you want to install off of Open Build Service, but it does exist. But the drawbacks for me is the documentation isn't as good as Fedora, Debian, or Arch, and the community for OpenSUSE is a little bit smaller compared to Debian, Fedora, and Arch. With all of that, are you guys going to switch away from Arch? Or are you guys fine? Or are you going to stay on Arch? Or were you not using Arch to begin with? Let me know in the comment section below. If you like this video, please shoot me a sub. It really helps a lot. You can also support a broke college student on Patreon. Right here, I have a video about alternatives to the AUR, if that is something you're missing. And right here, I have a video about the Fedora Everything ISO that lets you create an entirely custom Fedora install. With all that, I'll see you guys in the next video.